Today we discuss the results of the Oregon primaries. Welcome to Oregon News and Views from Social Advance. I'm Alan Zundell, and I am here with my co-host Charles Dunaway and our co-conspirator Randy Prince. Hello, gentlemen, and I use that word loosely.
Good morning.
Good morning. So let's get started with the primaries for the Democratic offices at the federal level. First of all, the presidential election. Bernie Sanders got 20% of the vote to Joe Biden's 66% of the primary vote in Oregon. That's much worse than Bernie Sanders' 56% that he got in 2016 running against Hillary Clinton, who at that time got 42%. Sanders got about 15 delegates as opposed to Biden's 46 delegates. So again, about 1/3 of what Biden got. Those delegates will go to the national convention. So of course, Sanders suspended his campaign, but he also asked people to continue to vote for him so he could get delegates to the national convention. But 20% is not a good showing for a movement that just a few months ago looked like it was dominating the field. And let's take a quick look at the congressional races as well. There were 4 challengers in each of our Democratic-leaning districts where we have Democratic incumbents. And those 4 challengers each aligned themselves with the Sanders movement and lost pretty badly. In Congressional District 1, we have Suzanne Bonamici, the incumbent, who got about 84%. Amanda Seaby, who was aligned with the Sanders movements, got only about 6.5%. And Heidi Briones, who entered the race late, actually outperformed Seaby, getting about almost 7%. In Congressional District 3, we have incumbent Earl Blumenauer, who got about 81% to Albert Lee's 16 and maybe 0.5%. In Congressional District 4, where we live, we have incumbent Peter DeFazio with 84% against Doyle Canning, who got about 15%. In Congressional District 5, one of the Sanders people did a little bit better. We have incumbent Democrat Kurt Schrader with 69%, and Schrader was probably the most conservative of all these incumbents, running against Mark Gamba, who only got 23%. So my question to you, gentlemen, is this Sanders movement within the Democratic Party now destined to expire? Is it just going to die of demoralization and scattered forces trying to figure out where to go next?
I think I would argue that it's already dead. I mean, the head has been chopped off and it's been flailing around the barnyard a little while, but it's over. And I think there are lessons that have to be learned here. One is that you can't build a movement around a person. That you can't expect that someone, it's not that's a campaign. That's not a movement. And the second thing is that the Democratic Party is really not progressive and does not intend to permit progressives to thrive.
I don't think this was the best environment for this campaign or movement. That the voter turnout was not especially huge, and much of the appeal, the hope, the promise Sanders presented was, well, we'll get those folks out who don't vote. There's a huge reservoir. That's what'll tip the election in our favor. And I didn't see that kind of turnout in this Oregon primary.
Well, one of the things I noticed was that even though the movement was built around Bernie Sanders, it was also based largely on the platform he presented, and all these congressional Democrats, the challengers, picked up that platform as well. So it seems like even that wasn't enough to get people, Democratic primary voters, to support these candidates. What do you make of that? I mean, they didn't suspend their campaigns. Some of them were campaigning really hard, raised a lot of money, got volunteers, were out there doing whatever they could.
Yeah, I think the virus did have a couple of effects. I mean, one is that it did cut down on campaigning, and it made campaigning more difficult, particularly for those who did not have the strong name recognition of an incumbent. But I think also there seems to be a mood in the country of just not wanting to change anything, just keep things going as they are, get us over this hump.
I think
And
it
what's
might be more of a mood of please nothing else terrible
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
Right.
what's the burning issue that stands out in any of the Sanders campaign for today? Well, the healthcare has often been identified as the top issue, and as far as relevant to the virus, that probably raised it. Otherwise, it's kind of an issue that was dealt with the under the Obama administration, and I see a lot of the. It seems like elections are kind of moving towards the person and the personality, the flaming hair, this sort of thing. It's what you know. What's that burning issue? Get us out of this war, or something like that. And I can't really put my finger on what would, other than income inequality, the billionaires, but no real obvious solutions there.
Well, probably the overriding issue is just what the Biden people always said for Democrats anyway, let's get rid of Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it does seem, I mean, it looks like Biden intends to campaign on Trump's
record.
Rather horrible handling of the COVID-19 problem. And Trump apparently wants to campaign on China bad, and it's the China virus, and, and that Biden is soft on China. I don't think that China ploy is going to work.
Well, we got 6 months to find out how things are going to go. Anything can happen this year.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick look at the Republican primary in Congressional District 2. The incumbent, Greg Walden, resigned, so we had about 11 people competing in that race for the Republican nomination. And the outcome was kind of surprising. Cliff Bentz, who did not raise the most money, he was about third out of in terms of fundraising, he came in first with 34.5%. Meanwhile, Newt Bueller raised over $1 million, had widespread name recognition from 2 previous statewide runs, only got 22%. And Jimmy Crumpacker, who also raised nearly $1 million, he's way down in 4th place, having been beaten by Jason Atkinson, who only raised about $240,000 and got 19.5%. So it looks like in this race, money was not the big issue. What was it? Any idea, Randy?
Voters really made the conservative choice. A legislator who has been in office in Oregon's legislature a long time. And people have risen from the Oregon legislature to Washington office before, Gordon Smith, for example. The personality of Bentz falls in line with his predecessor, the appeal, Walden, and before that, Bob Smith, particularly. So I don't think voters, Republican voters, really want to go out on a limb and vote for somebody like Newt Bueller, who has positioned himself as a moderate, but if you look at what it is, it's just a riskier choice, and he's trying to swing to the Trump appeal, and it didn't work.
Yeah, I think people knew Bueller a little bit too well already and know that he's kind of flip-flopping around.
Yeah.
I thought Bentz was the obvious choice as well. If I were a Republican, he was very much in line with Greg Walden's style, at least, kind of soft-spoken, presents himself as reasonable, even though he hits all the marks on the conservative positions. Anything to say about that, Charles, or could you?
Well, what's going on the Democratic side of that race? Not that it probably matters, but it looks like it's very close.
Yeah, there was a virtual tie between 2 of the candidates, Alex Spencer and Nick Hertz, I think his name is. Don't really know how that turned out yet, but neither of them raised much money, so I don't see him presenting much of a challenge come the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So let's turn to the top race at the statewide level. That's the Democratic primary for Oregon Secretary of State. And here, a result that surprised me a little bit. We had a near tie between 2 of the 3 candidates, Shemia Fagan with a little over 36% of the vote, And Mark Hass, State Senator Mark Hass, he came in with about 35.5% of the vote. That's just a margin of about 1.5 percentage points between them. Very close race. And then you had Jamie McLeod Skinner with 27.5% of the vote, which means we had a split vote again, where none of the candidates really got a majority of the vote. Near even between the two top ones, and then coming in close in the third place. Would the outcome maybe have been different if we had a form of ranked choice voting or star voting?
I think it would have been different. Listening to another program on public radio, those analysts, first one said, well, the winner was the most left wing, so it must have been Portland. Another pointed out that actually the most familiar candidate, Haas, won in the Portland area, which is generally the most left wing. I think that probably one of the two other candidates, Haas or McLeod Skinner, probably would have won out in a form of preferential voting over Fagan, who was the clear favorite among Democrats in those parts of the states where Democrats are kind of a left-wing fringe almost in the congressional district too. Haas had the most familiarity in Portland because of his many years as a broadcaster, a newsman, and as a leading legislator.
Not a real good case for preferential voting, because Shemia Fagan, who won, was not the most outspoken in supporting that type of voting. But let's move on.
Let me point out that in the preferential voting, I understand that the Republican won the independent party's preferential voting system for Secretary of State. I don't really associate the independent party as being Republican by default. I think they're more Democratic by default, but they did in this case go with the Republican under their system.
The independent party's online primary with star voting was very interesting. My sense of it was, with the high number of votes for Donald Trump, Joe Biden won for the presidential race, but there was a high number of votes for Donald Trump. My sense is that there was a group of conservatives somewhere who deliberately got in to try to boost the Republican candidates. Some kind of semi-organized effort behind it. Okay, well, let's look at the state legislative primaries, and here's where I went out on a limb. Not so much, really, because they were easy calls in most cases, and made some predictions for how things were going to turn out. In the state legislature, we had 152 races in all, and that's counting primary races for both the Democrats and the Republicans in each of the 60 House of Representatives seats and the 16 seats in the state Senate that were up for election. But incumbency was the overriding factor that determined most of them, and that's primarily by scaring away any challengers. There were 10 races in which no candidate filed for the party opposite the incumbent because nobody wanted to run against that incumbent, and another 117 races in which the incumbent was the only one who ran in their party's primary. That was a pretty easy call to say those races would be won by the incumbent. There were 4 races in which an incumbent was actually challenged, but in all those cases they won easily, even in the 2 cases where there were serious challengers. Those 2 cases, one of them was where Ben Bowman ran against State Senator Ginny Burdick, and still Burdick got about 69% of the vote against Ben Bowman's 31%, even though he raised nearly as much money as she did. And the other one was a House race where Paige Kreisman ran against the incumbent Representative Rob Noce, and she only got 34% against Noce's 65.5%. What are voters thinking when they choose incumbents over challengers? I recognize there's only 2 races here, but it seemed like there's a possibility they could at least do better than that in those races. Do voters really love their incumbents of their party all that much that they're not willing to change them out at all?
I don't know, unless the Oregon legislature has a lot higher approval rating than the U.S. Congress, but
it might.
It might. It probably does. It wouldn't take much.
That's right.
Low bar.
But it's I think a lot of these are just name recognition. A lot of this is just people don't know the challengers. They don't really have a way to get to know the challengers unless the challenger has tons of money.
Yeah, the money factor is really increased in previous decades, from being a thing where a few $1,000s might raise a good campaign. Now it's in the tens of thousands of dollars, and it's hard to get the voters' attention. So it costs a lot of money. You can have a good presentation in a voter's pamphlet. You can get noticed once in a while in the media and have some signs up. But unless you got 5 or 10 contacts, 5 or 10 times the person has heard of you, you're not going to stand much of a chance against the incumbent. And I think maybe people are a little reluctant to pick that crazy outsider for Oregon legislator now that they've seen one in the White House.
Well, both those things are important advantages of incumbency: name recognition and the ability to raise more money. So let's turn to look at the effect of money on the rest of the races where there was not an incumbent present, and that's just 21 of the races. So I looked at these and I compared how much each of the people running had raised in funds, and where there was a clear advantage in fundraising, I predicted a winner. In 14 of the 21 races, it was correctly predicted. The candidate with the most money won. In 4 of the races, my prediction was wrong, but in those 4 races, I had said in advance that the 2 candidates raised nearly equal amounts of money, so it was hard to predict. The fundraising advantage was not really that big in those cases. And finally, there were 3 races in which my prediction was wrong, except that in one of them, I made a mistake in taking notes on this. Both of the candidates in that particular race, they raised less than a few $100s. So the advantage in fundraising was not a big one by any stretch of the imagination. That would have been flagged as hard to call. One of the cases, the candidate who raised less money did win, but when I double checked on that, both candidates raised well over $100,000. So my sense of this is that there's a certain amount of money you have to raise in order to be competitive in a race, but then beyond that, there's diminishing returns to raising more money where it doesn't give you as big of an advantage. And finally, there was one race in which I was just plain wrong, and this was in House District 40 for the Republican nomination. Josh Howard had raised just about $2,000 in that race, and he got 59% of the vote. Daniel Toews, he raised about better than twice as much of that, $5,000, and he only got 40% of the vote. So looking into that, the only 2 factors that I could see that might explain Howard's victory over Toews was, number one, Howard had run for re-election before to the state Senate back in 2016, so he had some experience from that. And Toews, as I found out, he was associated with the Proud Boys far-right movement. So it looks like that may have been a disadvantage to him. Not sure about that, but a confirmation for that theory is when we go back and look at the Republican primary in Congressional District 5, which I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to because it was an interesting race, but I don't expect whoever wins that race to win in the general election. But there we had 2 candidates who were also associated with the far right, and they raised more money than the winners in that particular election. So we had Joey Nations, who was associated with demonstrations where a lot of white supremacists were there, and he was caught on camera punching an anti-fascist when he was laying on the ground. He raised the most money and only got 17% of the vote. And then Angela Roman, who was associated with militia groups, raised $16,000 and got only 8% of the vote. They were both beaten badly by Amy Ryan Corser, who raised only about $8,000, less than half of what Angela Roman raised, and a lot less than Joey Nations. She won with a majority, 53% of the vote. And then there was our friend Shane Dinkle of the humorous video that we all enjoyed so much. He actually came in second without any fundraising that I'm aware of what at all. He got about 20% of the vote. So my congratulations to Dinkle.
But the winner had not actually beaten up any anti-fascists or participated in any
Apparently
Proud
people
Boys
did
things.
not hold that against her.
All
I
right.
think it was a bad month for the voter insurgency on both sides of
Yes.
the electorate, and in that congressional district 5 race, the Democratic victor in the primary did significantly better than the other Democratic insurgent congressional candidates.
Yeah,
He had
that was
served as
Schrader who beat Mark Gamba.
yeah, and Gamba got significantly more than the others running in other congressional districts. He was the only one that held office. So a solid, non-insurgent type of choice did better in this election on the Democratic side and on the Republican side as well.
So you think even the perception of being on the so-called far left in the Democratic races was as much of a hindrance to people as being on the far right in the Republican primaries?
Yeah, I think especially coming off the Sanders suspension, withdrawal, whatever you want to call it, betrayal. You know, you have, I think, a demoralized left, at least within the Democratic Party, and they're, you know, that might have hurt a lot of turnout.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. We're running out of time here. We don't want to wear on people's patience. Next week, we will not be with you. We're going to take a vacation for a week, which we haven't had in over a half a year. So we all look tired, and that's why. Do check out our social media accounts where you can find this program and some of our back programs and old interviews and things like that, including Charles' podcast, A Wider View. Charles, anything to report on what's coming up?
Well, my interview with Barbara Boland of the American Conservative is now up on the website at widerviewradio.podbean.com and on Google Play, Apple, and YouTube. And it's quite interesting. I mean, we talked a little bit about the differences between the anti-war right and the anti-war left, and whether maybe we could get together on something.
Be an interesting prospect. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. From all of us to all of you, enjoy being stuck at home for the next couple of weeks.